one thing that's very clear is that in the first century, the church had this new foundation for community, and that it completely swept through and destroyed the old foundation for community. Why did that happen? It seems odd that in an obscure corner of the empire, an obscure carpenter who was put to death for something like sedition, and his followers scattered would, in the course of, say, 350 years, completely transform the Roman Empire and very shortly thereafter the known world. Why did it happen like that?
I would attribute it to the first three fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, and peace. When you see a people a community who by many measures didn't seem to have much in most of those communities, and yet had great joy, demonstrated great love and great sacrifice, and even had peace in the midst of persecution and suffering. It's just an indication to a lot of people who are outside that community that there's something there, and there's something more satisfying than pursuing my own glory.
Okay. And so when we talked about that, if you are pursuing your own glory, you're kind of pursuing your own isolation to a certain extent. And what you see in a lot of communities around the world, a lot of cultures around the world, is a stratification of society. How did the new kingdom that Jesus inaugurates, how did it deal with those stratifications of society? What ended up happening to those distinctions?
So they're broken down. Paul says there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, bond nor slave, or slave nor free, bond nor slave. And it breaks down those distinctions, and all of a sudden, you have people who would not be in community. You think of Paul hints that there's communities where you have both a slave and a slave owner in the same community, and things of this sort. And obviously in our culture that has a certain connotation. It's a little different here, but still that largely would not have happened in ancient Roman Empire, and yet in a Christian church it flourishes.
One of the things that Christianity sometimes gets a bad rap for is the idea that there was no call to end slavery. There was no call to end some of these things. And so some people would look and say, well, Christianity didn't break down these barriers or categories. But in a sense, they were, even if some of those distinctions stayed there, they were completely transformed. How does that happen?
We just talked a minute ago about esteeming others as better than yourselves, and whether you're an employee esteeming your boss as better than yourself, or a boss esteeming your employee better than yourself, the entire relationship is transformed, and both are better off for it. And you may still have a boss, and you may still have an employee. It's not that they're all of a sudden there's just two employees or two bosses or anything like this, but that the relationship is much more fruitful in the end.
So even when certain categories remain, they remain, but they're transformed. And I can imagine that if even in something as severe as a slavery situation, if a boss completely was identifying, or a slave owner was completely identifying with the good of his slave, and the slave was completely identifying with the good of his slave owner, that even if some of those categories remained for a time in the Roman Empire, those categories could be completely transformed into something that looked nothing like what they were before. So how does that work as far as the family and things like that? Obviously, we still have some of these categories and differences. Is the goal to, as some communists kind of see it, is to destroy all of those categories, completely obliterate them?
No, it's to transform what they accomplish. It's one of those things. I don't think anybody realistically really says, I just wish I didn't have a father, and for those who had a father and stuff like this, you wouldn't wish otherwise. You wouldn't wish that at all. But if you had to choose a father, and you said, I can choose one who attends church every Sunday, or I can choose one who's in prison every Sunday, as well as every other day, there's probably a clear distinction on which one you might think is a better shot of being the father you want and stuff like this. It's not really getting rid of these roles at all, but it's having them actually function the way God designed them to. The father is supposed to be a channel of blessing to those under his authority. And when that breaks down, everything breaks down.
Right. And so some categories will go away. Some categories will be transformed. The big one seems to be the idea of authority and just not liking being I mean, we all want to be in authority, but not liking to be under authority. What happens to the concept of authority in general in this new kingdom?
Obviously, you said we all like to be in authority and stuff like this. And the idea is that, the more authority I have, the freer I am to pursue my own glory, right? But in the new kingdom here, the more authority you have, the greater the charge you have of blessing those around you and under you.
So authority is kind of transformed into power and a way of pursuing my own ends, to responsibility for the well-being and blessing of other people. And so why would you want to pursue authority then? It seems like it's all downside.
I mean, is it all downside? There's something great about pursuing the ideal. And Jesus has the ideal, laid up all of heaven and all the glory he had with the Father to come down here and serve. And there's a glory that he now has again in the end at the right hand of the Father. And, and he says, for the joy set before me. And, you said it looks like there's all downside. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely times of downside when you are the one in authority. But at the same time, oftentimes there's that joy set before you. And that joy set before you is often intertwined with the blessing you're passing on to those who are under your authority.
Right. And so it seems like there's kind of this internal filter built in where if we posit the idea of authority in the right way, that it's responsibility, then the only people who will really want to pursue it are the people who are motivated by love of the good of who they will have authority over. That's pretty much how our political system works, is it not?
Yeah. The same way that I love my boys, I can know the fat cats in Washington. They love me the same way.
Yes. So how does the society become transformed then to this new idea where some categories are broken down and done away with completely, but others are transformed? And the biggest one is this view of authority, because I would argue that most people don't see that our culture is being transformed by this. So how do we transform it?
With great difficulty. But the same way I think that the culture in the first century was transformed as well, and it's an institution of love and sacrifice that is genuine and not contrived and stuff like this. And it does just transform the world around you. And it's one of those things too that you should be more concerned with the world immediately around you and not some transformation through the political system. I'm not saying you should ignore the political system or anything, but if you're more concerned about that and thinking that's where your transformation is going to take place and not worried about just the sphere that's immediately around you, you're making a great mistake.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of attention that can be given to the areas of responsibility that we each have in our own lives, and making sure we're using that responsibility well, rather than looking up the chain and looking at who has responsibility over us and trying to make sure that they're doing their job right. And I think that if we do that, we create communities that become attractive to the world as it pursues a different ideal. And the contrast between the communities that we create and the communities that they create is ultimately, just like the first century, what transforms our own culture.